Detroit, Michigan, the East Side. October 1967. The neighborhood carried that particular edge that comes from economic desperation mixed with ethnic tension, where different communities pressed against each other in uneasy proximity, where young men proved themselves through violence because they had few other options for respect or status. The streets here didn't care about philosophy or credentials or movie fame. They cared about one thing: could you handle yourself when things got real? The abandoned warehouse on Gratiot Avenue had become an unofficial fighting venue over the past year, a place where street fighters gathered on Friday and Saturday nights to settle disputes, prove superiority, or just entertain the crowds that gathered to watch violence unfold. No rules, no referees, no legal oversight, are just two people in a marked circle fighting until someone couldn't continue or submitted. Money changed hands through betting, reputations were built or destroyed, and the hierarchy of the streets was constantly being renegotiated through fists and blood. This wasn't organized crime exactly, though criminals certainly attended and profited. It was more organic than that, a cultural phenomenon that emerged from the neighborhood's particular combination of poverty, pride, and the absence of legitimate opportunities for young men to prove themselves. The fights drew crowds of 200 or more people, packed into the warehouse's main floor, the air thick with cigarette smoke and testosterone, and that electric anticipation that preceded violence. Me among the regular fighters was a man who'd built a fearsome reputation over 18 months of warehouse fighting. His name was Curtis "The Hammer" Johnson, and at 32 years old, he was considered one of the most dangerous street fighters in Detroit's East Side. Curtis stood 6'1", weighed 195 pounds of functional muscle built through manual labor and street violence rather than gym training. He worked construction during the day, carrying steel beams and swinging sledgehammers, work that built the kind of practical strength that mattered in real fights. His face told the story of his profession: a nose broken multiple times, scar tissue over both eyes, a jaw that had been fractured and healed harder, knuckles that were permanently swollen from countless impacts. Curtis had no formal martial arts training, and he had never been in a boxing gym, had never studied technique in any organized way. What he had was 20 years of street fighting experience, starting from neighborhood scraps when he was 12, an absolute absence of fear, a high pain tolerance built through surviving beatings that would have hospitalized normal people, and a fighting style that was pure Detroit street evolution, brutal, direct, overwhelming. He'd fight anyone, any size, any background, and he'd beaten them all. Boxers who thought their ring experience would translate to no-rules fighting, martial artists who discovered their kata didn't work against someone trying to cave their skull in, tough guys from other neighborhoods who came to challenge Detroit's reputation. Curtis's record at the warehouse was 31 wins, 0 losses, so with 23 of those wins coming by knockout and the rest by submission or stoppage when opponents simply couldn't continue. He didn't just win fights, he dominated them, usually ending confrontations within 2 minutes through sheer aggressive violence. Curtis had opinions about fighting, about what worked and what didn't, and he wasn't shy about sharing them. Real fighting, in his view, was about heart and toughness, and the willingness to hurt and be hurt. It wasn't about technique or training or fancy movements. It was about who wanted it more, who could take more damage and keep coming forward, who had the balls to stand and trade punches when things got desperate. He had particular contempt for martial artists, on seeing them as delusional people who practiced choreographed movements against cooperative partners and thought that prepared them for real violence. All the kata and forms and belt rankings, that was just theater, a way to sell lessons to people who wanted to feel tough without actually testing themselves. Real fighters looked a certain way, carried scars, had broken noses and cauliflower ears, showed the physical evidence of actual combat. Real fighters had been through the fire and came out harder. Bruce Lee arrived in Detroit on a Wednesday afternoon in October 1967, invited by a local martial arts instructor named Ed Parker, who ran a Kenpo karate school on the city's west side. Ed had met Bruce at tournaments in California, had been impressed by his speed and philosophy, and thought Bruce's approach could benefit some of his more advanced students. He'd arranged for Bruce to give a private demonstration at his school, maybe work with a few fighters, share some principles. Ed picked Bruce up from the airport and drove him to his hotel, making conversation about Detroit's martial arts scene, warning Bruce that the city's atmosphere was rough, that street violence was common, that there were fighters here who wouldn't respect credentials or reputation, only demonstrated ability. Bruce listened with interest, always curious about different fighting cultures, different approaches to combat. That evening, Ed took Bruce to dinner at a soul food restaurant on the East Side, a neighborhood institution that served the best ribs in Detroit according to locals. The restaurant was crowded. Mostly black customers with a few white faces scattered throughout, the atmosphere loud and energetic, music playing from a jukebox, conversations overlapping, laughter and argument mixing together in that particularly urban soundscape. They were finishing their meal when Curtis Johnson walked in with 3 friends, all of them large men who moved with that distinctive awareness of people who'd been in serious fights, who knew how to read rooms for threats and opportunities. Curtis was well known in the neighborhood, and several people called out greetings, a mixture of respect and caution in their voices. Curtis noticed Bruce immediately, not because he recognized him, but because Bruce was visibly out of place. A small Asian man in a leather jacket sitting with Ed Parker, who Curtis knew by reputation as a martial arts instructor. Curtis walked over to their table, his friends following, their presence immediately shifting the atmosphere around them. "Ed," Curtis said, his voice carrying authority, "didn't know you ate on this side of town." "Curtis," Ed replied, his tone carefully neutral. "Just having dinner with a friend visiting from California." Curtis looked at Bruce with undisguised assessment. "This the kung fu guy you've been talking about? The one from the TV show?" "Bruce Lee," Ed confirmed. "Bruce, this is Curtis Johnson, one of the most respected fighters on the East Side." They shook hands, Curtis's grip deliberately firm, testing, Bruce's response equally firm, but not engaging in the dominance game. "I've heard about you," Curtis said to Bruce. "People saying you're some kind of martial arts master, that you're revolutionizing fighting or whatever, want that you can do things that seem impossible." Bruce's expression remained neutral. "I teach martial arts and I'm constantly trying to improve my understanding. I wouldn't say I'm revolutionizing anything, just exploring what works." Curtis smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "See, that's what I don't understand about you martial arts people. All this talk about exploring what works, about technique and philosophy. Real fighting isn't complicated. Real fighting is about toughness, about being willing to take damage and dish it out. It's not about looking good doing fancy moves." One of Curtis's friends laughed. "Tell him, Curtis. Tell him what real fighters look like." Curtis gestured at Bruce's physique, visible through his fitted clothing. "Real fighters don't look like you, man. You're what? 140 pounds? Maybe 145? You look like a dancer or an acrobat. Real fighters carry weight, got scars, got broken noses, got the evidence of actually being in wars. You look like you've never been hit in your life." The restaurant had gone quieter, people recognizing Curtis, sensing confrontation, interested in how this would develop. Ed Parker tried to intervene. "Curtis, Bruce has fought plenty. He's just not advertising it on his face. Different approach to combat." Curtis ignored him, focused entirely on Bruce. "I fight every weekend at the warehouse on Gratiot. Real fights, no rules, against anyone tough enough to step up. Been doing it for over a year, never lost, put down 31 men who all thought they could handle street fighting. Boxers, wrestlers, karate guys like you, even a few professional fighters. Beat them all because real fighting beats technique. See, heart beats training." Bruce remained calm, his voice even. "You've obviously proven yourself in that context. Warehouse fighting against willing opponents, that takes courage and toughness. But fighting has many contexts, many variables. What works in a warehouse with specific conventions might not be the only effective approach." "Specific conventions?" Curtis's voice rose. "Man, there are no conventions, no rules, no time limits, no illegal techniques, just 2 people fighting until one can't anymore. That's as real as fighting gets. And in that reality, technique doesn't matter. What matters is whether you can take a punch and keep coming, whether you've got the heart to stand and trade when it hurts." Bruce chose his words carefully. Taking damage isn't the goal in combat. The goal is achieving your objective while minimizing harm to yourself. If you can end a confrontation quickly through precision rather than absorbing punishment, that's preferable. You're proving my point, Curtis said, his smile widening. You're talking about minimizing harm, about precision and quick endings. That's theoretical fighting. Real fighting is messy, it's brutal, it's about who can survive chaos and pain. And surviving that requires looking like a survivor, carrying the marks of battle. You look like you've never been in a real fight. Several people in the restaurant were watching openly now, conversations stopping, everyone sensing this was building towards something significant. Bruce set down his napkin carefully. If you're interested in testing whether appearance correlates with fighting effectiveness, then I'm willing to demonstrate. Ed Parker's expression showed alarm. Bruce, you don't need to prove anything to anyone. This is supposed to be a friendly visit. But Curtis's pride was engaged now, his reputation invoked in front of witnesses. He couldn't back down without losing face, without suggesting that maybe his certainty about real fighting was less solid than he'd claimed. The warehouse, Curtis said. Saturday night, this weekend. You and me, real fight, no rules. We'll see if your kung fu works when someone's actually trying to hurt you, when there's no cooperation, no choreography. Before Bruce could respond, one of Curtis's friends spoke up. Curtis, this guy's a celebrity. He gets hurt, there could be legal problems, police attention. We don't need that heat. I'm not going to seriously hurt him, Curtis replied, although his tone suggested otherwise. Just going to teach him a lesson about real fighting versus movie fighting. Show him what happens when technique meets toughness. Bruce looked at Ed Parker, who shook his head slightly, silently advising against accepting. But Bruce understood that refusing would be interpreted as fear, would become a story Curtis told about how the famous martial artist backed down when challenged to real fighting, and that story would spread, would undermine everything Bruce taught about martial arts effectiveness. One exchange, Bruce said clearly, not a full fight. You attack me however you choose, full commitment, real intent, I'll defend and counter. That will demonstrate whether real fighting beats technique or whether they're not actually in opposition. One exchange proves nothing, Curtis protested, when anyone can get lucky once. Then you should have no problem demonstrating your superiority, Bruce replied calmly. If real fighters beat technical fighters, if toughness overcomes precision, one exchange is enough to show it, unless you're uncertain about your assessment. The challenge was clever, using Curtis's own certainty against him, making refusal look like doubt. Curtis looked at his friends, saw them watching, felt the eyes of the restaurant on him. Saturday night, warehouse on Gratiot, Curtis confirmed. One exchange, your call. But when this doesn't work, when your technique fails against real fighting, don't say I didn't warn you. The warehouse on Gratiot Avenue was packed. Saturday night, over 250 people crammed into the space, word having spread through the east side that Curtis Johnson was fighting the kung fu guy from TV. See, that this was more than just another warehouse match. This was a test of philosophies, street fighting versus martial arts, Detroit toughness versus Hollywood technique. The crowd was overwhelmingly on Curtis's side, neighborhood people who knew his reputation, who'd seen him destroy opponents, who believed in the street fighting ethos he represented. They'd come to see him validate their worldview, to watch technique get destroyed by real toughness. Bruce arrived with Ed Parker and two of Ed's senior students, walking into an atmosphere that was openly hostile, facing a crowd that saw him as an outsider, a pretender, someone who'd come to their territory making claims that needed to be tested with violence. He wore simple black pants and a dark red Chinese-style shirt, moving through the crowd with calm awareness, and showing no fear despite being surrounded by people who wanted to see him fail. Curtis was already in the marked circle, shirtless, his scarred torso on full display, evidence of every serious fight he'd survived. His body wasn't aesthetic in the bodybuilding sense, was functional and hard, built for taking and delivering punishment. Next to him, Bruce looked impossibly small and unmarked, his 145 pounds of lean muscle impressive in definition, but appearing fragile compared to Curtis's battle-tested frame. The size difference was significant, about 50 pounds, and the experience difference was even more pronounced. Curtis, with 20 years of street fighting, versus Bruce's martial arts background. Someone had set up crude lighting, bare bulbs on stands that created harsh shadows and made everyone look more menacing. The circle was marked with spray paint on the concrete floor, about 20 feet in diameter, and the crowd pressed tight around it, people standing on crates and equipment to see better, everyone wanting to witness this clash. Curtis stood in the center, arms crossed, looking confident and dangerous. His friends stood nearby, ready to intervene if things went too far, though their definition of too far was probably pretty extreme. Ed Parker stood with Bruce at the edge of the circle. "This is a mistake," Ed said quietly. "This guy's not like the controlled demonstrations you do. He's actually going to try to hurt you, and this crowd will support him if things get ugly." "I understand the risks," Bruce replied, "but sometimes the only way to prove a principle is to demonstrate it under the exact conditions skeptics claim will invalidate it. So Curtis thinks real fighting beats technique, thinks appearance indicates capability. This is the test." "What kind of attack is he planning?" Ed asked. "Based on his reputation, probably a rushing attack," Curtis said from the circle, having overheard. "He'll try to close distance fast, use his weight and power, overwhelm before technique can develop. That's how street fighting works, aggressive forward pressure." Bruce nodded, stepping into the circle. The crowd erupted in hostile noise, people shouting challenges and insults, the atmosphere violent and chaotic. Curtis uncrossed his arms and rolled his shoulders, making his scarred functional body flex and shift. "You sure about this?" Curtis asked, giving Bruce one last chance to back out. "Once we start, I'm not holding back. I'm coming to hurt you. Asked to prove that real fighting destroys fancy technique." "I'm sure," Bruce replied simply. Curtis looked at the crowd, saw them watching, feeding off their energy. Then he looked back at Bruce, and something shifted in his expression. The friendly challenge replaced by genuine aggression, by the mindset that had carried him through 31 warehouse fights. "Let's see how your kung fu holds up when someone wants to break you." Someone in the crowd counted down, and the warehouse went relatively quiet. 250 people waiting to see street fighting validate their belief that toughness overcame everything, that scars and broken noses and battle damage were the true marks of a real fighter. Curtis exploded forward with frightening aggression, closing the distance in 3 powerful steps. His right hand already cocked back for a devastating haymaker punch aimed at Bruce's head, the kind of looping power shot that had knocked out 24 opponents, thrown with genuine intent to cause serious damage. But the punch never landed. What happened next occurred with such speed and precision that most of the crowd couldn't process it in real time, would argue afterward about what they'd actually seen. As Curtis's haymaker came forward, Bruce shifted his entire body slightly to the left, maybe 8 inches of movement, but perfectly timed to make Curtis's fist pass by his head with perhaps 2 inches of clearance. Simultaneously, Bruce's left hand rose and struck Curtis's extended arm at the inside of the elbow, not hard but precisely placed, disrupting Curtis's structure and causing his punch to deflect further off target. Before Curtis could even begin to retract his arm or reset for another attack, Bruce's right hand shot forward in a straight punch, covering maybe 10 inches of distance, and struck Curtis Johnson directly on the jaw, just in front of the ear, at the precise angle that caused maximum rotational acceleration of the skull. The impact was a short, sharp crack that cut through the warehouse noise. Curtis's head snapped to the side from the rotational force. His eyes immediately went unfocused. His legs lost their strength. His arms dropped to his sides, useless. He stumbled sideways 3 steps, his famous toughness and pain tolerance completely irrelevant because Bruce hadn't attacked his toughness, had attacked his nervous system, had scrambled the signals between his brain and body through precise biomechanical application. When then Curtis's knees gave out, and he sat down hard on the concrete floor, blinking rapidly, his mouth opening and closing, trying to speak but finding his coordination temporarily offline, looking confused and shocked and utterly defeated. The entire sequence from Curtis's initial charge to his position sitting on the floor took maybe 3 seconds, maybe less. The warehouse exploded in shocked exclamations, the crowd's hostile energy transforming into disbelief and confusion. Curtis Johnson, undefeated warehouse fighter, the man who'd beaten 31 opponents through pure toughness and heart, was sitting on the floor looking dazed while the small martial artist he'd dismissed as a dancer stood over him completely unmarked, not even breathing hard. If you're watching this story and learning something about Bruce Lee you never knew before, if this is showing you the reality behind the Hollywood legend, hit that subscribe button right now, because there are dozens more documented stories that prove Bruce Lee was absolutely the real deal. Curtis's friends rushed to his side, helping him to his feet, checking his pupils, his responsiveness. Curtis was already recovering, his coordination returning, his mind clearing, but the shock was still evident on his face. What the hell was that? Curtis's voice was slurred slightly. I threw my best punch and then nothing. Just suddenly, I'm on the ground. You threw a committed power punch, Bruce explained, his tone educational rather than mocking. Your entire structure was focused on delivering that punch, which created predictable movement patterns. And I slipped outside your line of attack and countered to your jaw at the angle that causes maximum rotational force to the skull. When the skull rotates suddenly, the brain moves inside the cranial cavity, temporarily disrupting neural function. It's the same principle behind boxing knockouts, but I'm using precision and timing instead of power. The crowd was pressing closer now, everyone trying to understand what they'd witnessed, how the small martial artist had just put down their champion in seconds without breaking a sweat, without showing any damage, without appearing to exert significant effort. One of Curtis's friends, a large man named Marcus who'd fought at the warehouse himself, spoke up angrily. That was a lucky shot, just caught Curtis at the right moment. Do it again. Let Curtis try a different attack. Curtis waved him off. I'm still testing his balance, still processing. That wasn't luck, Marcus. He knew what I was going to do before I did it. Made my punch miss by inches, hit me so precisely that my whole body shut down. That's not luck. That's skill I've never encountered before. But I've taken harder punches, Marcus protested. I've seen you take shots that would knock out normal people and keep fighting. How did one punch from this guy put you down? Because he didn't try to hit harder than I could take, Curtis replied, his voice showing genuine awe. He hit exactly where and how my body couldn't defend. All my toughness, all my scar tissue, all my experience taking damage, none of it mattered because he attacked my nervous system, not my toughness. And if you're enjoying this story, if you're fascinated by these real accounts of Bruce Lee's abilities, I'll hit that like button because it helps more people discover the truth. Ed Parker had moved to Bruce's side, looking relieved that the demonstration had ended without serious injury. The crowd's energy was still volatile, people arguing about what had happened, some claiming it was fake or staged, others insisting they'd seen Curtis genuinely get dropped, that the shock on his face was real. Bruce addressed the crowd, his voice carrying across the warehouse. What just happened wasn't about disrespecting Curtis Johnson or street fighting. It was about demonstrating that fighting effectiveness doesn't correlate with appearance. Curtis said, real fighters carry scars and broken noses, look battle damaged. But that damage is evidence of taking hits, not evidence of superior fighting ability. The goal in combat should be ending confrontations while minimizing damage to yourself, not accumulating scars that prove you can absorb punishment. Several people in the crowd shouted disagreement, defending their belief that toughness and battle damage proved fighting legitimacy. But Curtis himself raised his hand for silence. He's right, Curtis said, and his voice carried authority that made people listen. I've been telling myself for years that my scars and broken bones proved I was a real fighter, that taking damage made me tougher. But this guy just showed me that not getting hit is better than being able to take hits. He slipped my best punch like it was moving in slow motion, countered so precisely I didn't even feel it until I was already going down. That's not movie fighting. That's understanding combat at a level I've never reached. Marcus still looked skeptical. Curtis, you've beaten professional fighters, guys with training and credentials. This kung fu guy puts you down once and suddenly he's superior? Curtis shook his head. It's not about superiority, it's about understanding. I've been optimizing for toughness, for being able to survive damage and keep fighting. He's optimized for not being where the damage is aimed, for ending fights before they become wars of attrition. Different approach, but clearly more effective for actual combat. One of the warehouse regulars, a street fighter named Tommy, who'd lost to Curtis 6 months earlier, pushed forward. Mr. Lee, I want to try. I've got a different style than Curtis, more grappling-based. Let me see if I can get my hands on you. Before Bruce could respond, Curtis intervened. Tommy, don't. I'm telling you, this guy sees things we don't see. He knew what I was doing before I finished doing it. You try to grapple him, same thing will happen. But Tommy's pride demanded the attempt, and Bruce nodded agreement. One exchange, same conditions. Attack however you think best. Tommy took a restless stance, lower center of gravity, hands ready to shoot for a takedown. He feinted high, then dove low, going for Bruce's legs with good technique, the kind of double-leg takedown that had worked countless times in his street fighting career. Bruce's hips moved backward faster than Tommy's hands could reach, a perfectly timed sprawl that made Tommy's grasping hands close on empty air, and before Tommy could reset, Bruce had moved to his side and placed his hand lightly on the back of Tommy's neck. I'm not striking, just demonstrating position. In a real confrontation, that ends it, Bruce said quietly. Strike to the base of the skull causes immediate unconsciousness. But this is demonstration, so I'm just showing the opening. Tommy remained on his hands and knees, understanding that if Bruce had followed through, the fight would have been over. He stood up slowly, testing his neck, finding it unmarked, but understanding how vulnerable he'd been. How did you move that fast? Tommy asked. Your hips were back before my hands got close. Because I read your setup, Bruce explained. Your weight shift told me you were shooting low, your eye level drop confirmed it. By the time your hands moved, I was already responding to your intention, not your action. If you've made it this far in the story, leave a comment below telling me what surprised you most about this account. Was it how quickly Bruce handled Curtis, the precision of his techniques, the respect he showed afterward? I read every comment and want to know what resonates with you. The warehouse atmosphere had completely changed. Hostile challenge transformed into genuine curiosity and respect. Curtis Johnson, who'd started this by saying, "Real fighters don't look like Bruce Lee," was now the most vocal advocate for reconsidering that belief. Mr. Lee, Curtis said, his voice carrying humility that people who knew him recognized as rare. I came at you with disrespect, said your martial arts were just movie tricks, claimed real fighting was about toughness and scars. You just proved me wrong in about 3 seconds. Would you be willing to teach me? To show me what real fighting looks like beyond just being tough enough to absorb damage? Before Bruce could answer, a dozen voices joined in. Street fighters who'd been skeptical minutes ago now eager to learn from someone who'd just demonstrated capabilities they'd never encountered. Bruce looked around at these hard men, these street fighters who'd built their identities on toughness and battle damage, now genuinely interested in learning a different approach. What I teach requires unlearning before you can learn, Bruce said carefully. You've all built fighting styles around forward pressure, around overwhelming opponents through aggression and pain tolerance. Learning what I teach means accepting that sometimes not engaging is better than engaging, that evasion is more valuable than toughness, that precision matters more than power. Are you willing to question everything you've built your fighting identity around? I am, Curtis said immediately. You put me down in seconds, made 20 years of street fighting experience look useless. If you're willing to teach, I'm willing to learn. Bruce pulled out a card and handed it to Curtis. This is my contact information. I'm in California, but I travel to Detroit occasionally. Next time I'm here, come find me. We'll see if you're serious about training or just reacting to being humbled. Curtis took the card with genuine gratitude. I'll be there, and I'll bring an open mind. Ed Parker spoke up. Bruce is giving a demonstration at my school tomorrow afternoon, 2 o'clock. Anyone interested in seeing more techniques, understanding the principles behind what just happened, you're welcome to attend. The crowd began dispersing, up in small groups forming to discuss what they'd witnessed, arguing about implications, questioning assumptions they'd held for years about what made someone a real fighter. Curtis's friends gathered around him, checking on him, discussing the fight, clearly shaken by seeing their champion defeated so quickly and completely. Before we finish, I need to ask one favor. If this story gave you new perspective on Bruce Lee, on street fighting, on what real combat effectiveness looks like, please share this video. Send it to someone who fights, who thinks toughness is everything, who judges fighting ability by scars and broken noses. Sharing helps preserve these real stories. Curtis approached Bruce one more time before he left. "Mr. Lee, thank you for not seriously hurting me when you could have. For demonstrating your point without trying to humiliate me in front of my neighborhood. You could have followed through with that punch, could have knocked me out completely, could have made me look worse than you did." "You didn't extend the courtesy beyond necessity," Bruce replied. "You challenged me with genuine belief that your approach was superior, not with malice or cruelty. You deserved an honest demonstration, not humiliation." The demonstration at Ed Parker's school the next afternoon drew over 80 people. The warehouse fighters, mixed with traditional martial artists, street fighters learning from karate students, different fighting cultures meeting through shared interest in what Bruce Lee could teach them. Bruce spent 3 hours breaking down principles, demonstrating techniques, explaining the philosophy behind Jeet Kune Do, and answering questions from genuinely curious students regardless of their background. Curtis Johnson attended and brought 5 friends from the warehouse fighting scene, all of them taking notes, asking intelligent questions, their earlier skepticism replaced by eager desire to understand. They'd seen proof that fighting had dimensions they'd never explored, that appearance didn't indicate capability, that someone could be unmarked and unscathed and still be devastatingly effective in combat. Over the following months, Curtis became a regular correspondent with Bruce, training when Bruce visited Detroit, integrating principles into his street fighting approach. His warehouse fighting record continued, but his style evolved dramatically, less reliance on absorbing damage and more emphasis on not being where attacks were aimed, less power punching and more precise striking, less toughness and more technique. He eventually retired from warehouse fighting undefeated, his record standing at 47 wins, 0 losses. But he would always say that his defeat by Bruce Lee, though not recorded in his official record, was the most important fight of his career because it taught him that everything he'd believed about real fighting was incomplete. Years after Bruce's death in 1973, Curtis was interviewed for a documentary about underground fighting culture in Detroit. The interviewer asked about the famous warehouse encounter with Bruce Lee. Curtis's answer became one of the most honest assessments of street fighting's limitations ever recorded. He described his earlier certainty that real fighters carried battle damage, that scars proved legitimacy, that toughness overcame technique. He talked about how Bruce had shattered that certainty in 3 seconds, demonstrating that not getting hit was superior to being able to take hits, that precision overcame toughness, that understanding combat at a deep level made accumulated battle damage irrelevant. But most importantly, he talked about what the encounter taught him about the difference between winning fights and understanding fighting, about how he'd spent 20 years confusing success with mastery, about how being undefeated in warehouse fighting didn't mean he'd achieved real expertise, just meant he'd been tougher than his specific opponents in that specific context. The documentary included photographs from that night, grainy images showing Curtis on the ground looking dazed, Bruce standing unmarked, the shocked faces of the crowd, and later, images of Curtis training at Ed Parker's school, this street fighter learning that real mastery required more than accumulated scars and battle damage. The warehouse on Gratiot eventually closed, the building condemned and demolished in the early 1980s, but the story of what happened there in October 1967 lived on in Detroit's fighting culture. Told and retold, becoming legend mixed with fact, inspiring arguments about technique versus toughness that continue today. Hit that subscribe button one final time if you haven't already, because Bruce Lee's story is filled with moments like this. 3-second exchanges that challenged fundamental assumptions, demonstrations that proved the impossible, humble teachings that transformed understanding and opened minds to possibilities beyond current knowledge. The legacy of that warehouse fight extends far beyond Curtis Johnson's personal transformation, beyond Detroit's street fighting scene, beyond even the broader question of whether martial arts can work in real fights. It represented a meeting point between different philosophies of combat, between street toughness and martial arts precision, between the belief that battle damage proved legitimacy and the understanding that avoiding damage demonstrated superior skill. Curtis Johnson had 31 warehouse victories, carried scars from hundreds of street fights, had a broken nose and cauliflower ear, and all the physical markers he believed proved he was a real fighter. Bruce Lee weighed 50 pounds less, looked unmarked and undamaged, appeared to Curtis like someone who'd never been in a real fight. By every measure Curtis believed in, that he should have destroyed Bruce easily, his toughness and experience overwhelming any technique the smaller, unmarked man possessed. But in 3 seconds, Bruce proved that real fighters don't necessarily look battle-damaged, that scars prove you've been hit, not that you're good at fighting, that the goal in combat is ending confrontations while remaining unscathed, and that someone who looks like they've never been in a fight might simply be better at fighting than people who carry evidence of every battle they've survived. Curtis told Bruce that real fighters don't look like him, that battle damage and scars were the marks of legitimate fighting experience. 3 seconds later, Curtis was sitting on concrete, struggling to understand how he'd gotten there, his worldview shattered, his education beginning. His certainty replaced by the humility that comes from discovering your expertise was incomplete, and someone half your size understood dimensions of combat you'd never explored.